The Silence of the Lambs, the 1991 American film based on Thomas Harris's acclaimed novel, stands as one of cinema's most revered and influential masterpieces. A chilling and pulse-pounding thriller featuring stellar performances from Jodie Foster, Anthony Hopkins, and Scott Glenn, it shattered box office records upon release and etched into popular culture the unforgettable diabolical charisma of Hannibal Lecter. Yet, even Lecter's shadow paled at times before the film's other serial killer, Buffalo Bill, whose real-life echoes resonate in the annals of true crime. James Gump, better known as Buffalo Bill, kept his victims captive for days in a dark pit within his basement before their gruesome demise, skinning them to fashion clothing from their hides, much like the infamous Ed Gein. The notion of imprisoning them in a hole draws inspiration from another harrowing true story, that of Gary Heidnik, a tale that proves reality often eclipses fiction. On the night of March 24, 1987, in Philadelphia, a young man named Vincent Nelson answered his insistent doorbell to find his ex-partner, 25-year-old Josefina Rivera, in a state of utter disarray. She had lost significant weight, appeared deeply agitated, and uttered incoherent words. Once calmed, she revealed a nightmare. She had been held captive for months by a man who tortured and raped her and 5 other women in his basement, killing 2 and leaving 3 still imprisoned. She claimed her captor waited in a gray car nearby, having been duped into thinking she was visiting her children. Vincent, furious, stormed out to confront the man, but Josefina urged him to call the police, insisting on the perpetrator's extreme danger. Soon officers arrived and spotted a luxurious Cadillac parked near a gas station, occupied by a man in his 40s who seemed serene yet bewildered when approached. Gary Heidnik, 43, was tall and burly, with a beard and piercing bluish-gray eyes that occasionally widened unnaturally. Dressed in a fringed leather jacket, he appeared unkempt. Josefina identified him as her assailant, and he was swiftly taken for interrogation on sexual offense charges. Meanwhile, an officer stood guard at 3520 North Marshall Street, the address Josefina had described. The house looked abandoned, piled with debris. At 4:30 a.m., reinforcements arrived with a search warrant and forced entry. Inside, the agents were stunned. The walls were papered with coins and dollar bills, an eccentric display amid the overwhelming stench. They hurried to the basement, where they found 2 semi-naked black women chained by their ankles to a pipe on a filthy mattress. As flashlight beams cut through the darkness, the women screamed hysterically until the officers reassured them. Pointing frantically, they directed attention to a stack of sandbags in the corner. Removing them revealed a wooden board. Beneath it, in a small, damp hole, lay a 3rd woman, alive but curled in a fetal position. The survivors were rushed to a hospital where they were treated for trauma, malnutrition, dehydration, and numerous wounds inflicted by their captor. In the kitchen oven, police discovered charred human ribs, and in the refrigerator they found a woman's arm and parts of her legs. Josefina later disclosed that Heidnik had fed them human remains mixed with dog food for weeks. Another body was later found in a New Jersey woodland. During Heidnik's interrogation, authorities seized over $2,000 in cash, credit cards, and titles to 4 luxury vehicles, including a Lincoln, a Rolls-Royce, a 1964 Plymouth, and the Cadillac. He presented himself as the bishop of his own creation, the United Church of the Ministers of God, a quasi-sect where he reigned as leader. When confronted with evidence of the women and remains, he claimed they were there when he bought the property. His explanations for the atrocities grew increasingly absurd, unraveling a saga of horror that continues to inspire writers, screenwriters, and musicians. Gary Michael Heidnik was born on November 22, 1943, in Eastlake, Ohio, to Ellen and Michael Heidnik, who later had a second son, Terry. Their marriage dissolved amid Ellen's chronic alcoholism and Michael's violent temper. After the divorce, the boys lived with their mother briefly before being sent to their father, who had remarried and turned his sadism on them. Gary, plagued by childhood bedwetting, endured public humiliations, such as having his soiled sheets hung from the window, and terrifying abuses, like being dangled upside down from the balcony. These traumas forged a shy, nervous personality in Gary. Marked by asocial tendencies and narcissism, he felt superior to others and fantasized about total control, all while excelling academically. His isolation deepened after a fall from a tree during puberty left an alarming deformity on his head, subjecting him to relentless bullying. Though his IQ remained exceptionally high, between 130 and 148, the incident exacerbated his quirks. At 13, he developed a fascination with military life, reading war books and dressing in uniform. He enrolled in a Virginia military academy at 14, earning top marks but left just before promotion, citing mental issues without seeking treatment. By 16, he had attempted suicide multiple times. Enlisting in the Army at 18 in 1961, his erratic behavior, vision problems, rule-breaking, and loan sharking among recruits led to over 20 psychiatric evaluations. Discharged in 1963 with a lifelong disability pension of $2,000 monthly, he turned to stock market investments, amassing a fortune through his teenage studies of finance. Yet, wealth brought no joy. Heidnik lived frugally in a rundown lodging, favoring cheap clothes and fast food while indulging only in luxury cars and a gold Rolex. His social circle consisted of the vulnerable, homeless people, addicts, and mentally impaired black prostitutes whom he manipulated for control. He offered them food or money to visit his home, where consensual encounters escalated to abuse, humiliation, and deprivation, followed by gifts to confuse and silence them. His sexual drives were insatiable, demanding encounters 4 times a day. In 1971, his mother's suicide from cancer plunged him and Terry into depression, requiring medication. That year, he founded his church to exploit tax exemptions and acquire property, hiring a local to recruit homeless black individuals for sermons and meals, netting over $500,000. Despite successes, his mental health deteriorated. Diagnosed with schizophrenia, he checked into psychiatric facilities over 20 times but took medication sporadically. In 1976, he shot a tenant during an argument. Charges later dropped and nearly killed his brother in another dispute. By 1977, obsessed with fatherhood, he fathered 3 children with mentally impaired black prostitutes, all of whom were placed in state care. In 1978, he kidnapped Alberta Davidson, sister of his girlfriend Aljanette, from a Pennsylvania facility, holding her captive, assaulting her, and infecting her with gonorrhea. Though Aljanette vanished suspiciously, he was convicted only of Alberta's kidnapping, serving 3 of 7 years in prison, mostly in psychiatric wards. In 1983, he bought the North Marshall Street property for $15,900, using it for church gatherings, a facade for his descending spiral of depravity. In the shadowy underbelly of a perilous neighborhood, shrouded by dark alleys, prostitution, and drug trafficking, gunshots echoed at all hours. The streets teemed with addicts, beggars, and the mentally afflicted. Precisely the environment Gary Heidnik craved, seeking out the vulnerable. In 1985, through a marriage agency, he met Betty Disto, a young Filipino woman, and persuaded her to travel to the United States for marriage. She agreed, but the union quickly unraveled into nightmare. Heidnik ruled as a tyrant, confining her to their home, subjecting her to abuse, and denying her food. He even invited other prostitutes to their bed, claiming it was commonplace in America and demanding she accept it without protest. 3 months later, pregnant and desperate, Betty fled. Though she filed charges against him in 1986 for marital violence and mistreatment, she failed to appear in court and the case was dismissed. Heidnick's life remained entwined with obsession, paying for prostitutes' company yet finding no fulfillment. Fixated on fatherhood despite having children he was barred from raising, he devised a monstrous plan to abduct women, impregnate them, and forge his own twisted family. On November 26, 1986, he lured 25-year-old prostitute Josefina Rivera to his North Marshall Street home. His affluent appearance, luxury car, Rolex watch, and gold chain disarming her suspicions. Once inside the disheveled house, he offered pornographic or horror films which she declined. After forcing himself upon her, as she tried to leave, he seized her throat and began to strangle her. Sensing her peril, Josefina promised compliance in exchange for her life. He relented, handcuffing her and dragging her to the basement, a makeshift dungeon. Dark, damp, and cold, with boarded windows, sandbag-insulated walls, iron doors, and barbed wire-topped barriers. He chained her to a pipe on a filthy mattress, then fell asleep with his head in her lap. Over the following days, she endured repeated assaults, her terror mounting as he dug a hole in the corner, which she feared would become her grave. Seizing a moment alone, Josefina escaped by prying loose a board with a billiard cue, slipping out through the window via her long chain. She screamed for help in the yard, but only Carrie Heidnick heard her, dragging her back and beating her savagely before confining her in the hole as punishment. 3 days later, Heidnick brought another captive, 25-year-old Sandra Lindsay, whom he had known before. She had once been pregnant by him but chose abortion despite his breeds. He chained her alongside Josefina, promising more women to join them. As the abductions continued, Lisa Thomas on December 23rd, Deborah Dudley on January 2nd, and Jacqueline Askins on January 18th, Heidnick's reign of terror escalated. He subjected them to sexual abuse, beatings, and starvation, punishing disobedience by imprisonment in the hole. The women lived in squalor, yet some resisted, cursing him and fueling his paranoia. To silence their cries, he blasted the radio and television, and in a fit of madness pierced the eardrums of several with a screwdriver, leaving them partially deaf. Josefina, however, received preferential treatment, occasional freedom to use the bathroom or share his bed, breeding resentment among the others. Sandra's defiance provoked his sadistic fury. He suspended her from the ceiling for a week without food, and when she weakened, he force-fed her bread, accidentally asphyxiating her. In a grotesque display, he dismembered her body in the kitchen as the women watched in horror, feeding parts to his Doberman, storing others in the freezer and compelling the survivors to consume the rest mixed into dog food under threat of death. Paranoia consumed Heidnick. He believed they plotted against him, inspecting the basement for weapons. On March 19, 1987, he forced Lisa, Deborah, and Jacqueline into the hole, filled it with water, and made Josefina electrocute them. Deborah died from the ordeal, and he enlisted Josefina to help dispose of the body in a remote New Jersey woods, coercing her to sign a false confession. Gaining his trust, Josefina bided her time, eventually earning outings that allowed her to escape on March 24th, seeking help from her ex-boyfriend and ending the nightmare. Heidnick faced trial on June 20, 1988, in Philadelphia's City Hall, charged with murder, kidnapping, rape, unlawful detention, assault, criminal inducement, and corpse abuse. The defense claimed insanity, citing his schizophrenia diagnoses and voluntary psychiatric stays, but prosecutors argued his financial genius. built from stock investments and his own church, proved his lucidity. Expert testimony confirmed he understood his actions' gravity. The victim's harrowing accounts, including accusations against Josefina as a possible accomplice, sealed his fate. Found guilty on July 1, 1988, he was sentenced to 120 years in prison and 2 death penalties for the murders of Sandra and Deborah. Incarcerated from March 24, 1987, Heidnik became a target for fellow inmates, spending much of his time in solitary. Executed by lethal injection on July 6, 1999 at age 55, his psychological profile remains baffling. A cruel, unpredictable killer who manipulated the vulnerable yet exhibited symptoms of schizophrenia long before his crimes, blending genius and madness in a life of calculated horror. Despite possessing a genius-level intellect, he chose to surround himself with individuals of limited mental capacity. This was a clear attempt to feel superior, a choice that speaks volumes about his profound insecurity and low self-esteem. It is likely he felt threatened when interacting with people of average intelligence, and his wealth also served to place him in his own mind a rung above everyone else. Initially, the belief was that Heidnik targeted only black women due to a deep-seated racism. But a curious detail complicates this narrative. On all his official documents, he identified himself as an African-American man. The lingering question is whether he genuinely perceived himself this way, or if it was merely another of his many eccentricities. Perhaps the head injury he sustained as a child, one so severe it physically deformed his skull, played a role in his behavior, causing irreversible damage to his brain. His family's history of suicidal tendencies might also point toward underlying mental disorders. However, specialists are categorical on this point. Such issues arise from a combination of genetic and environmental factors. While a predisposition may exist, they are not considered directly heritable. In a television interview, audiences got a closer look at Gary Heidnik. He appeared somewhat agitated, yet his gaze was cold and piercing. When speaking of his crimes, he simply downplayed them. A classic trait of a psychopath. He remains, without a doubt, one of the most enigmatic and twisted figures in the annals of American true crime. I've left a link to my criminology blog in the description, as well as a link to purchase my book, Human Monsters, a 430-page volume where I delve deeper into the subject of serial killers. My name is Alvaro, and this is the Crime Channel.